You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me for Rise in Crime, your morning caffeine hit all about crime. I'm Mama Jules, and let's get to an update on the Karen Read trial. I had someone liken the Karen Read trial to Boston's version of LA's O.J. Simpson trial. And I think if you live in the area, you most likely are highly invested in the trial and could have even chosen a tribe, because there's the pro-John O'Keefe side that naturally believes the Boston Police Department and other agencies handled the investigation with integrity. Or you're on the pro-Karen Read side, believing that law enforcement has been corrupt in Boston for years. Remember, Karen is accused of backing over her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe. She was dropping him off after a night of drinking at a fellow officer's home. Karen said she was headed home due to tummy issues, but others say the couple were navigating some turbulent waters in their relationship and that Karen, in a fit of rage, harmed John when he insisted upon continuing the night of drinking at Officer Albert's home. Now, the defense believes the partygoers are responsible for John's death and that the investigation was compromised when close friends of the Alberts were directly involved. All right, let's get to the testimony because the case resumed on Monday. The court was in session on Monday. They weren't in session on Tuesday or today, and they won't be on Friday. So we only got Monday and Wednesday this week. Now, during Monday's court day testimony, it's centered all around Karen Read's Lexus SUV. Investigators say they found red and clear plastic in the snow where John died. Prosecutors argued that the fragments came from the taillight of Karen's SUV. The defense in their opening arguments already warned the jurors that they felt like the evidence was planted and that the investigators had plenty of time to do so. Well, on Monday, defense attorney David Yannetti asked Lieutenant Kevin O'Hara, who was on the witness stand at that time, if he was aware that the crime scene had never been locked down. Lieutenant O'Hara said he was not aware, but evidence from an SUV was also presented. A state crime lab analyst testified that Karen's SUV sustained damage that included a smashed taillight, and that there were also some scratches and a single strand of human hair. Now, that lab analyst also testified that the sweatshirt John was wearing on the night of his death, they say that sweatshirt was torn, but it wasn't just torn once. 13 different tears were found in the sweatshirt, and most of those tears were on the right sleeve. Now, the defense said in their opening statements that they believe a dog made those tears and that there wasn't any impact with the SUV that caused that amount of tearing. But prosecutors believe the sweatshirt damage and also the blood on the sweatshirt were both a result of the backing over of John by Karen. Now, that lab analyst that was on the stand, she would not declare how the tears were sustained. Last week in testimony, the jurors heard from federal agent Brian Higgins. Now, he's been implicated in the death of John O'Keefe by Karen's attorneys. See, it's part of their third-party culprit theory, which the judge has allowed to have argued by the defense. So who's Brian Higgins? Well, he is a special agent with the U.S. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. He testified that he had exchanged flirtatious texts with Karen despite Karen and John being in a relationship. Brian Higgins acknowledged on the stand that he extracted those texts from his phone, just those texts, the flirtatious ones, and he took those from his phone before throwing away the phone during the murder investigation. Brian Higgins said he had to throw the phone away because during a separate investigation, someone had obtained his number and he felt that compromised his position at the Bureau. He said he got a new phone just one day before being served with a court order demanding he preserve his phone. So he's supposed to turn it over, but he destroyed everything except the text between him and Karen, and he did it all the day before he was served the papers. Now, of course, Read's lawyers felt the timing was suspicious. Attorney Yannetti said to Higgins while he was on the stand, he said the following: "You knew when you were throwing that phone and the destroyed SIM card in the dumpster that from that day forward, no one would ever be able to access the content of what you and Brian Albert had discussed by text messages on your old phone." Now, the defense attorneys were implying that this destroying of evidence was just one more piece of the elaborate puzzle that law enforcement has developed to cover up John's murder. And speaking of disposing of phones, guess who else disposed of his phone the day before it was requested to be turned over to authorities? Officer Brian Albert, who owned the home where John died and who was conversing with our other cell phone destroyer, Brian Higgins. Brian Albert said on the stand, it was simply a timing issue. He was upgrading his phone, and that just happened to coincide with destroying the phone just one day before it was requested. Now, the defense has also claimed that Brian Albert and Brian Higgins, who were both at the home on the night of the death, have had select conversations where they have tightened up their stories so that they match. All right, let's go to this third-party culprit defense. The attorneys say it includes both Brians, Brian Higgins and Brian Albert. But are there more partygoers involved? The defense says yes. A third partygoer, Brian Albert's nephew, Colin Albert, well, apparently, according to the defense, he had a beef with John O'Keefe, and the defense says that means he was in on the fight that eventually killed John on that night. Okay, it does seem like the defense is kind of knocking it out of the park there, right? Well, the prosecution also had some highlights. And last week, one of those highlights happened when they talked about how Karen had an elevated blood alcohol content on the morning of John's death. All right, so several hours after she and John and many others had visited at least 2 bars and had consumed alcoholic beverages, Karen's blood was tested. And the prosecution is theorizing that her blood alcohol content at 12:45 a.m. was most likely around 0.135 and 0.292, somewhere in that range. You guys, that's much higher than the legal limit. And she has admitted that she was driving and dropped John off at the party and that she drove herself home. Now, another point of interest from the prosecution side was the testimony of John's niece and nephew. John had been raising the two following the deaths of their parents. John's teenage niece testified that she heard Karen say in the days following John's death that she was worried she had hit John with her Lexus. And John's nephew testified that John and Karen had a contentious relationship, but he also admitted on the stand he had never seen the two become physically violent with each other. All right, so we've covered all that. Let's catch back up to the trial and what was happening on Wednesday when I had to record this episode. On Wednesday, the trial picked back up with the state crime lab analyst back on the stand. She spent the first hours painstakingly describing her process of photographing, examining, and finding, quote, mechanical fit for the various pieces of the taillight housing. She basically was showing the jury how she used the microscopic shards to rebuild the puzzle of the taillight. And according to the Boston Globe, this was a tough couple of hours for the jurors to get through, and several of them didn't take notes. Under cross-examination by Yannetti, the analyst did admit that the taillight evidence collected by Trooper Michael Proctor, okay, he's the lead investigator on the case and also a good friend of those people that are involved in investigating this case. Well, they say that evidence was collected much later than the initial evidence was collected at the crime scene. So how much later? 5 days later. The defense contends that the timeline is suspect because the first pieces of taillight were apparently collected from the crime scene 5 days after the death. Then more taillight evidence was collected 8 days after the first collection, and that's 13 days after the death. Now, the prosecution is asking you to believe they couldn't uncover the evidence due to snow, and that is why the dates of collection are so much later. The defense pointed out to the jury that this isn't the only timeline collection that is suspect. They asked the analyst when John O'Keefe's clothing was collected and delivered to the crime lab, and the analyst said it was 6 weeks after his death. All right, this trial is in its 7th week, and the defense could rest as early as next week. Obviously, I will keep you up to date in the next episode since we are nearing the end of the trial. I would love to hear your thoughts on the trial and if the evidence was compromised. And there's one thing about bringing you these crime updates. There's always a new, not rational action by criminals, and it happens all the time. Something that makes you go, I've never heard of that. And this story definitely has a, I've never heard of that angle. Back in May of 2020, so freshly into the pandemic, 41-year-old Clint Bauer was arrested on an outstanding warrant for disorderly conduct. He was familiar with law enforcement. On the day of the arrest, Clint had bonded out of jail, and cops even drove him back to his trailer park. And cops were certain he showed no signs of harming himself or others. But later that night, Clint and 41-year-old Micah Harrington were having a conversation inside the laundromat at the Mausolea Travel RV Park. Well, something set Clint off, and surveillance footage shows Clint pulling out a large butcher knife and lunging at Micah, stabbing him repeatedly. All in all, 30 stab wounds were found on Micah's body, and enough of those lunges with the knife entered Micah's arm that the entire arm was severed from his body. After Micah lay there, motionless, Clint left the laundromat and walked to his nearby trailer to change his bloody clothes. He then walked back to the crime scene and enacted a plan. And here's where the I've never heard of that portion of the crime comes into play. Okay, here's how it works. It seems Clint thought that if he could get Micah's body to the Bow River Resort and Casino that was just located 10 miles away, he would be able to find someone who could put Micah's body back together. So Clint ties a rope around Micah's body and begins dragging him outside to trek the 10 miles. Well, witnesses saw the carnage and the dragging, and they called the cops, who arrested Clint rather quickly. Now, all of that happened 4 years ago, and this week, in a Biloxi, Mississippi courtroom, Clint pled guilty to killing Micah. His first-degree murder plea earned him a sentence of life in prison. Clint told the judge during the hearing that he thought Micah was a threat to him, but Micah didn't have any weapons. He also admitted to the judge that he has struggled with mental health issues. WLOX reported that when he spoke to the courtroom, he told the judge he was truly sorry for what had happened. He then said he wanted everyone to know that it was beyond his control. He also recognized the gallery by saying, "I know y'all grieved his loss." Clint's attorney, in an effort to help his client, told the judge that the fact that his client thought he could go to a casino to cobble a murder victim back together is a prime example of his mental health problems. This was a devastating end to Micah's life because Micah was also familiar with law enforcement. He had struggled with drugs and alcohol earlier in his life, but Micah had won the battle. He had gotten sober and he had started working a construction job. He had even rekindled a relationship with his daughter, Micah. The relationship was going so well that Micah moved to Biloxi to be closer to her dad. She told WLOX that she was truly proud of her father, that once he got sober, it was like looking at a dad she had never seen before. Micah's coworker told the Sun-Herald that he worked with Micah almost 7 days a week, and he could see the progress he was making. The coworker said Micah was creating a life for himself so that he could make a home for his daughter to return to. Now, the Sun-Herald also reported that his daughter wanted Clint to receive the death penalty, but Judge Dotson took into account the mental difficulties that Clint had struggled with and chose the lighter sentence of life in prison. And in what was an if-only moment during the sentencing, it was revealed that Clint had scheduled an appointment with Gulf Coast Mental Health, and that appointment was supposed to occur just a few days after the murder. He knew he needed help. On Facebook, Micah's mother, Debbie, expressed her frustration just 2 weeks ago in a post that reads like this: 6 more days, and it will be 4 years. 4 of the longest years of my life. It isn't right that the police just handed your killer to you when he should have been in jail. He should not have been let out the first time. But then, when they got the call about the disturbance he was making at his mother's house, they should have taken him back to lock him up. The lies, the cover-up, protect the police at all costs. You will never get the justice you deserve because the police will never have to pay for what they have done. And the next story that I'm bringing you is criminal, but I normally wouldn't choose to update you on this kind of case, except it involved the son of the co-founder to Buc-ee's. So shout out to Austin, Texas, where I visited my first Buc-ee's. And I'm just saying, everyone should visit an extra large Buc-ee's sometime in their life. Okay, if you don't know what Buc-ee's is, it's a convenience store, but mega size. And there are 48 of them that exist in more than 10 states. They have EV charging stations, dozens of fuel pumps, world famous candy and beef jerky, baked goods, tacos, fresh sandwiches, clothes, souvenirs, and travel necessities. They are even praised for their extra clean bathrooms, and they hold the record for the world's largest fueling station, which is located in Sevierville, Tennessee. So now that I've introduced you to what a Buc-ee's is, if you didn't know, it's important to find that out because in this story, Mitchell Wasick, okay, he's the son of Buc-ee's co-founder, Don Wasick. Well, Mitchell has been charged with allegedly using spy cameras to record people in his home. According to court documents released on Monday, the 28-year-old was arrested in October of 2023 after an incident with friends at his family's lake house on Lake Travis in Spicewood, Texas. All right, that lake house is owned by Mitchell's dad, Don, the co-founder of Buc-ee's. And here's what the friends say happened. Mitchell invited people over to the lake house for an overnight stay. One of those friends happened to work in cybersecurity. That tech-smart friend found a charging port containing a hidden camera plugged into the guest bathroom wall. And being in cybersecurity, the friend swiped the device and took it with him when he left the home. A couple of the friends gathered together and used a card reader to view the contents on the device. The court documents say that they found dozens of videos of themselves and others in bathrooms and bedrooms, all in various states of undress and actions. Now, another witness told authorities she also found videos of herself and another friend in Mitchell Wasick's bathroom. So the primary bathroom had a device as well. The friends turned the devices over to authorities, and the Travis County Sheriff's Office began investigating the claims made by the friends. According to the court documents, investigators allegedly found a total of 68 videos containing at least 13 different individuals, filmed in 8 different locations in the home. The individuals in the videos were recorded using the toilet or showering or changing their clothes, and even a few videos had film of individuals engaging in sexual activity. Investigators then used a warrant to obtain Mitchell's Amazon purchase history. That history included purchases of several hidden camera devices that were sent to multiple addresses. The Travis County District Attorney's Office took the case before a grand jury, and that grand jury returned 6 separate indictments against Mitchell Wasick. The evidence of the recordings allegedly happened over a 2-year time span. Now, at this time, the case is so new that I can't really identify how much time or penalty will be facing Mitchell if he is found guilty. But 11 Alive reports that Texas law states that an invasive visual recording is a jail felony, and it can result in a maximum of 2 years in prison per count. And since that story was a little off our usual pathway of crime, let's just keep going with a dead woman waking up in a Nebraska funeral home. At least medical authorities had said she was dead. 74-year-old Constance Glantz was in a hospice care at the Mulberry Nursing Home in Waverly, Nebraska. On Monday, Constance was pronounced dead at the long-term care facility. Her body was then transported to Bethuras, I hope I'm saying that right, Bethuras, Mazer, and Love Funeral Home in Lincoln. Well, as staff were preparing her body for the funeral and burial, they discovered Constance was still alive. She had been deemed dead for more than 2 hours before the funeral home realized she, in fact, was still living. Now, KOLN reported that the funeral home staff immediately called 911 while performing CPR on Constance. She was transported to the hospital, but Constance did die there a few hours later. Lancaster County Police Chief Deputy Ben Hushin made sure to state publicly that the funeral home did nothing wrong, that they were the ones who found her to still be alive as she was being handed over to the funeral home staff. Chief Hushin also says at this time there is no evidence of a crime, but they did send Constance's body for an autopsy to discover all that they can about her, not just one death, but her second death in the same day. Now, I wish I could tell you more about Constance. My mom died from cancer at nearly the same age as Constance, and the hospice nurses were the best of the best. They even brought some home-baked goods to our family on the day that she passed. I'm sure Constance was loved as well. But if you think Constance is an unusual case, this same thing happened just 4 months ago in New York. Back on February 6th of this year, an 82-year-old woman who was living at the Waters Edge Rehab and Nursing Center in Port Jefferson, well, she was pronounced dead and transported to the O.B. Davis Funeral Home. A little more than 2.5 hours later, the woman was discovered to be breathing while on the funeral home stretcher. She was transported to a local hospital and resuscitated. This case is being reviewed by the Attorney General in New York, and I don't have any update to the findings. But in another story, just 1 month before the New York case, in January of this year, a 66-year-old woman was found to be dead at Glen Oaks Alzheimer's Special Care Center in Urbandale, Iowa. And just like the other two stories, the woman was transported to a funeral home and placed inside a cloth bag that was zipped shut. Within an hour, staff members at the funeral home discovered she was alive. This woman lived for 2 more days before dying for a second time. A determination has been reached in this case, and the hospice care facility was fined $10,000. My heart goes out to the families in all 3 of these cases. Experiencing grief, it's tough, but having to navigate the death announcement twice is truly so heartbreaking for their families. All right, you guys, that's your Thursday episode of Rise in Crime. I'd love if you'd share the podcast with a friend, and please leave a 5-star review and rating or a comment. And you can also like and follow us on all of our social media and YouTube accounts. We have the 3 shows, Rise in Crime, Murder with My Husband, and Into the Dark. They're all part of Oh No Media. You can join me again on Monday for more morning crime news. I'm Mama Jules, and keep safe out there.